let me go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Crawford. I am the digital storyteller and professional learning coordinator for IDEA. I know it's a weird conglomeration of things to be doing, but I spent 13 years teaching in an ELA middle school classroom, and then I moved into instructional coaching and then professional learning. And along the way, one of the things that became really important to me was understanding neurodivergent learners, especially because everything that we do is in a neurotypical environment, essentially. Our world is a neurotypical world, and neurodivergent people really are a marginalized community. And we have to figure out as educators how we can help address that and move forward and really make an inclusive experience for our students. So what we're going to talk about today is autism acceptance, not autism awareness. And that really is for the fact that April is typically seen as Autism Awareness Month. We're going to talk about why we should shift that thinking, some things that we need to be looking at for our own classroom environments when we're working with autistic students. And then also kind of like the why behind those things, because that's always important. Now, I will tell you, this is something that I'm super passionate about, and it's pretty easy to talk for way over 1 hour. So we have a lot of information. We're condensing it down into this hour time frame, a little bit less because I'll leave time for questions too. But I'm hoping that it will spark some of that curiosity and getting maybe a shift in some of the thinking that we have. If you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat. I think Heather is here. She's our silent idea person today. You'll see her there. She'll kind of help guide me, I think, into the chat if I'm missing something. So don't worry. I promise that any question will get addressed. All right. So you can see from this slide here, this first one up, that I have hashtag lighted up red. And the reason for this is because what we're used to seeing is the blue surrounding, lighted up blue surrounding autism awareness. And the autistic community has specifically asked for the shift to light it up red. And we're going to talk about that as we go on through, but just keep that in mind. We're lighting it up red now. All right, as we go through, I just want the reminder to be everything that we talk about, just like any time that we're talking about shifts in our thinking, it's really easy to start making that personal, right? Like taking it personally. I want you to remember it's nothing personal as we're going through. What we're doing is highlighting autistic voices and what they're asking and looking at ways we can shift what we're doing. And if we've done some of those things that we're looking to shift, that's okay. That's part of our growth. Once we know better, we're going to try to do better. Okay, the first thing that I like to start with is I've had this said to me before about people. I could tell they were on the spectrum. So if you've ever, and I've probably thought those things before too, so it's not like I'm removing myself from this, but remember, this is part of that growth. So really what started a huge shift for me is and yes, I've gotten permission from him to talk about this. Never out anyone on their diagnosis. They always must have permission in that. But my 14-year-old got a late diagnosis for autism. He was already into 5th grade. He had gone through kind of having the reputation of, well, he's so smart, but he's lazy, or he just is argumentative. He doesn't want to have friends, those type of things. It was frustrating for him feeling that way in school. And it was frustrating for me when he was coming home, especially as a teacher. I feel like you always have that, like when you're a teacher and you have these expectations of what your kids might do and how they should act because you're a teacher and they're going to know that. And it doesn't work out that way always. So with my own son, when we got him in for a diagnosis, it was life-changing. That is not overstating it, because he wanted to have the information to know why he responded differently in situations, why certain things were hard for him, and how he could learn more and educate himself on that. But the thing that I've found is that we tend to have, if we're neurotypical, tend to have this idea that we can pinpoint someone who's on the spectrum. If that was true, then my son wouldn't have gone through, because I would have been able to identify, his teachers would have been able to identify, but instead we have these stereotypes that live in our minds about what it means to be autistic. And for him, when I asked for the principal to start the process to get him evaluated, the principal said, looked me in the eye, said, I don't know that I'm going to approve this because he's too smart. He's not going to qualify for anything. And that is where we tend to fall. We have this idea that if you're autistic, you have to have a certain kind of behavior. Maybe you don't communicate verbally. Maybe you spend a lot of time stimming. And we see those as bad things. And we see that as a student being unable or sometimes even unwilling to be present in that learning environment. So as we go through, we have to remember, we can't actually tell when someone is autistic. What we can tell is sometimes they might have trouble making eye contact. They might need to fidget. That doesn't mean autism, by the way. That could be any neurodivergency. That could be ADHD. It could be that they have, you might think when a student fixates on something that they're just being argumentative, but you have to remember that a fixation on details, on those technical values, that's important to a lot of autistic people. And it's not that they don't want to move forward, but they can't move forward. So those are the things, again, that we're going to be looking at. How do we make sure that we're open to that in our classrooms and remembering those things? So one of the things that we don't do anymore is we don't use Asperger's as a diagnosis. And so when we're talking about our students, we shouldn't be referring to them as an Asperger's diagnosis. And that's really because the history of Asperger's, in case you're not familiar with it, is Dr. Asperger actually, he wasn't part of the Nazi Party, but he did actually have a part in sending children to be euthanized. He made the decision. And so for him, the children with autism who had like a high enough level of autism that they were, intelligent instead of unintelligent, they got to survive. So when we look back at the history, it's really the whole eugenics of it that autistic adults are not okay with. We're saying that if you have autism as an Asperger's diagnosis, that you're somehow better. It maintains that hierarchy in the community. And what they're saying is we need to get rid of that so that we can start really having awareness. Okay, we all know awareness is there. Most people now, not 30 years ago, people weren't all aware that autism was a thing, but now we're all aware. So we need to take that awareness piece away and do acceptance. And part of acceptance is realizing that there's not a hierarchy. And Asperger's is actually not an official medical diagnosis any longer. So that has been taken off the books. Right. So when we talk about awareness, like I just said, we all know autism exists. Now, when these campaigns started, once again, I will say 30 years ago, not everyone knew. There wasn't a lot of information, not a lot of research. And really, even in schools, it wasn't a population that was really talked about. So when we talk about why not awareness, it's important to hear autistic voices. Through this whole thing, that's what we need to do, is center autistic voices. That is not to say that all autistic people agree. That would be ridiculous. That would be like saying every teacher agrees on something, which we know is impossible, right? That would be like saying that every marginalized community member of that group agrees on the same thing, on the terminology and all that. That's not how it is. But what we do is we have to start listening to the autistic voices, not the organizations that are putting themselves out there that are not led by autistic people. And we have to start being willing to shift based on what we find then. So this is actually my son. When I was talking to him, I was telling him about doing this. Again, he is an advocate because he wants students to not go through the same thing that he has gone through. So when I was talking to him, how do you feel about awareness versus acceptance? And he said that when I hear awareness, it makes me think it's something I need to stay away from. He then furthered it by saying, it's like when people have a disease and we want to be aware of the disease. And he's absolutely right. When we talk about awareness, we want to avoid it. We want to be aware of the problems caused by it. But autism isn't a problem. My son isn't a problem. And instead, we need to accept that autism has makes our minds work differently than my neurotypical brain. He is going to process things slightly differently, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong way, and it doesn't mean that it's a disease that needs cured. So you might think, what about the puzzle piece? Because the puzzle piece is prevalent. It's everywhere, right? Well, the puzzle piece, going along with that, if we think about awareness, the puzzle piece makes autistic people feel like you're saying there is something missing in them. They are not a whole person. There's a puzzle piece missing. It doesn't fit, but they're still good enough. They don't want to be good enough. They are good. They are good already. They are just as good as we are. So when we talk about the puzzle piece, they don't want to be associated with having to try to make something fit or missing a piece. And I put the other image of the puzzle piece in the ribbon in here with autism awareness because I want to, again, call attention to it. When we see ribbons, it's for diseases, right? It's for cancer. It's for heart disease. It's eliminating something. Let's bring awareness to it so we can eliminate it. I wasn't aware really until, again, my son gave me a whole new perspective. As a teacher, I had autistic students, and I could talk with my special ed teachers who might have 504s for different accommodations, right? But it's not the same as seeing it from this side, which is where, again, this passion came from. For my son to look at an image and feel like he needs to be changed, we wouldn't do that to any of our other students. So why are we doing that to our autistic students? Even in the best intentions, this is where we learn impact, right, over intentions. So even if your best intentions are to help other students see that autistic people are just like everyone else, if you're using a puzzle piece and you're lighting it up blue, those things end up having negative impacts. So I think that this graphic is helpful, and we're going to go through some of this too. So it's very simple the way I've labeled it, not helpful and preferred, right? Again, that's very general terms. And once again, you won't find 100% continuity through the autistic community, but in general, this is what they're asking for. So the blue side, when we talk about autism awareness, the things that they have over there is that people say person with autism. Now, you might be thinking that normally person first language is preferred. And sometimes that's true. But what the autistic community says is, I am autistic. It is part of who I am. It is not bad. It's not something I want to hide. It's not like a bag that I carry with me. I'm not a person with autism. I'm not a person on the spectrum because I'm not standing on anything. Like, I am autistic. That is what they're looking for, is actually in this case, specifically with autism, is identity first language. So you can see again that ribbon makes an appearance with the word disease. Not a disease. We have early intervention, as if it's something that if you catch it early enough, you're going to stop it. You're going to make sure that you eliminate it and nothing bad will happen. There's the functioning labels, which we're going to specifically talk about. So blue is associated, the autism awareness is associated with functioning labels. My son would have been labeled high functioning. We absolutely do not talk about functioning labels here. Tragedy. The autistic community, I will tell you, has a large problem with what they call autism. They do specifically say autism moms because it's generally moms that are on those blog spaces, but autism parents, because dads can just as easily do this, where they're using their autistic children to gain notoriety, to gain sympathy, to put their stories out there and say, it's been so hard, feel sorry for me because my life is so difficult with what I'm going through with my autistic children. For autistic adults who look at that, to them, it's really discouraging to see that parents are treating their children as something that they need sympathy for because they're not acting quote unquote normal, right? So the whole idea of the tragedy is that it's especially parents who will say that they need sympathy for that. We also have the epidemic, again, as if it's a disease that's spreading through that we need to stop, and the lighted up blue here. But when we flip that and we look at the preferred, we can see that really there are two things. There's this rainbow that shows up here. You see it in the heart, you see it in the light bulb, you see it in the infinity symbol. You also see a gold infinity symbol. What autistic people have asked is that you start using the rainbow, because rainbow is for all neurodivergent learners. You start using the gold or red. And what they look at it as with the red instead, or lighted up gold hashtags, gold is universally accepted by everyone as a color of worth. And red is seen as the opposite of blue. Okay, so we're going to have positive feelings associated with that. You can also see, instead of diseases and early interventions, it's accommodations. What do I need to do to help make this environment one that you can positively function in and show what you know? Pride in it instead of hiding it. A lot of autistic adults will still hide their diagnosis because their employers will treat them differently when they know that they have autism. That's one of those things. We have this stigma that if you have autism, it goes back to what we talked about before, that I can tell that you're autistic. You can't. But if I know that you're autistic, I might start discriminating against you. And autistic adults live with that on a daily basis. And a lot of them learned in school to hide who they were because it would lead to bullying or being treated differently. So notice that it's collaboration. This is collaboration between all the stakeholders, like collaboration between the teachers, collaboration between the students, collaboration between the parents. Free stimming. This is a hard one for us because when we're in a classroom with 30 kids, it can drive us up the wall when we have lots of people making lots of movements, noises. So it's not saying it's a free-for-all. What it's saying is that free stimming. So I'm going to use my son for an example here again. My son absolutely stims. By the way, we all really do have some sort of stims. It just normally ours might be caused by, if we're neurotypical, maybe an anxious situation. So if you've ever bitten your nails, if you ever take your hair and start twisting it when you're in an anxious situation, those are all things that are stimming. We all do that. They help us cope with whatever situation is there. But for autistic people, that stimming is a much larger part of their world, because it helps them continue focusing on what is important. So you'll see that ADHD students will do the same thing with stimming because they're neurodivergent as well. But with free stimming, you might have a student who likes to make noises. They might not even know. Autistic people, just so you know, again, not across the board, but there is absolute research out there to show that because they have hearing sensitivity a lot of the times, they will make noises that they're not even aware of in order to shut out the other noise around them. So my son would frequently, we would have this note, and it was before his diagnosis. You know, he's been asked to stop making noises. Nobody else is making noises, but he won't stop. Well, here's the thing. He was unable to stop, because everything was so loud around him and for his senses that he couldn't stop making that noise. So when we got a diagnosis, we were able to say, okay, you can have noise canceling headphones that you wear. You can still hear the teacher. You can still participate, but that's an accommodation for you. And that stopped the need to make the sounds. For other stimming, it might have been he likes to move. So they gave him a fidget that actually worked for him because of the texture. It had marbles inside of it and a textured little tube, I guess is the best way to say it. And he would be able to, that helped him with the movement piece because he would always like to move his hands. That helped him not have to do it the same way, but he was still stimming and it was appropriate for the situation. So this requires you, if you have a student, I know that there's always the time. There's never enough time. But really, to make our environments inclusive, if you have a student who you notice, maybe you've told them to take down their hood, but they keep putting it up. That could be that the hood is comfort and safety. That can be a part of the thing that you need to figure out, how can we accommodate that? Or can they have it up? Or do they need to leave the room for a minute because maybe their emotions are getting overwhelmed? That's why the hood goes up. Maybe they need to stand up and be able to work at a counter. That's what we have to be able to do, is that free stimming, not a free for all, but we have to figure out what we can allow our autistic students to do to help them. Centering autistic voices. So even though I am neurotypical, the reason that I am doing this is because I'm going to help highlight autistic voices. We're talking about what they want. So when you are looking at reading books about autism, try to vet your authors and see, are you reading a book that was made by an autistic or written by an autistic author? Was there help from the autistic community? Did they use the autistic community as resources? How are they involving the community in that? Because you can have, again, the best intentions, but if autistic voices aren't represented, you're missing the biggest piece of the puzzle. Then you can see inclusion is huge. So everybody wants to have their place. So having an autism diagnosis should not mean that you are not part of the whole group. Okay, that's a lot of information on one graphic. I absolutely realize that. And it was a lot of talking. So I just want to make sure there are no questions before we move on, give you a chance to process that. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat where you can unmute and you can ask. I'm going to give us just a little quiet there to give you time in case you need it.
Yes, Stephanie, I have a question. I was wondering if you could give some examples of people first phrasing, and also could you speak more on impact over intentions?
Yeah, absolutely. Is it era or ara?
Either.
Okay. So era, what I mean by people first language is that typically what someone would want you to do is say, it's a person with whatever disease they have, right? It's a person with cancer. It's a person with diabetes. It's a person with heart disease. So we say person first language because the person is what's important in that. But what the autistic community is saying is that put their identity first, because it's not a disease. It's not something that they're just living with in tragedy. It is who they are. So that is why they want to be considered an autistic person, the autistic student, the autistic adult. Instead of saying that it's something that you're living with, it's who you are. So I hope that one helped. And then you had, now it's, I didn't keep it. Ara, I'm so sorry. Okay, can you remind me? You asked for the person first.
Yes, yes, impact over intentions.
Impact over intentions. Okay, so this graphic here, when we talk about impact over intentions, your intentions might be, let's say that you have an event to bring what we would normally call awareness to autism. And you do it because you want to make sure that autistic students feel included in the school environment. You want them to feel like they have a place. Your intentions are good. Your intentions are about helping your students find a place that they belong and helping other students understand that differences don't mean bad, right? So your intentions are good. But if you're using the ribbon, if you're using the puzzle piece, if you're using the color blue, if you're talking about autistic people with functioning labels, if you're doing those things, then the impact is a negative impact, even though your intentions were good. So what we say is that it's impact over intentions, that we can be in the right place with why we're acting a certain way. But once we understand that the impact is actually negative on that community, we need to change our actions so that our intent is still good, but our impact is also good. Did that help?
Excellent. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions before we move on? I see I have a chat notification here. Let me see if I can open that up. There we go. Okay, can you suggest alternatives for frequent sound making that peers find distressing if they already have their own challenges with focus/distraction? That one is a hard one, Barbara. What I have found, I don't have something that I can say this will work definitely for you. What I have found is that most autistic students that I have worked with and that I've spoken with have preferred direct communication. They are not trying to be problematic. Normal. It's like any student, though. Sometimes students are trying to be problematic, right? It doesn't matter whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent. Sometimes they're just making choices to see what the reaction will be. But I'm talking about in general. If you have an autistic student who is making the noises as they're stimming, what I have found is that if you can have a direct personal conversation, because here's the thing about a lot of autistic people, especially as students as they're developing, they have a very low self-esteem. When I talk about very low self-esteem, I'm not talking about just some days we don't like ourselves. So if you're familiar with, I'm not sure what everyone's background is, you will have that the process, the student has to fill out the questionnaire on how they feel about themselves. Oftentimes, what you'll see if you listen to those is that they have no sense of self-worth. Again, my own son has given me permission to talk about this, but for him, he doesn't act like anything is wrong on a daily basis. You wouldn't know it from speaking to him, but when he answered the questions honestly, you found that he didn't understand why any of his family wanted to be with him. He didn't understand why friends would want to be around him. He didn't think that he brought anything to the table. He wasn't sure what he had to offer, and that actually they might be better off without him. This is not abnormal for our autistic students, because they really feel like they don't fit in. They can tell that there's things that they aren't doing that neurotypical people do. A lot of times that might be in social situations. So if you can have a direct conversation with them and ask them, like, I know why we're doing this. I understand why you're making the noises, but I need us to find something that would work instead. Can you help me think of some things? Here are some things that I thought might work. What do you think might work? If that conversation is possible, what I found is that you will be more likely to get the student to actually use a different form of stimming that is comfortable for them once they understand why you're asking them to change. And then Robert says, I know my cousin has autism. He would not like to be referred to as autistic, but I get it. Yeah, Robert, that's one of those things, like I said, in every group, there will never be 100% agreement on that. So obviously, if your cousin does not want to be referred to as autistic, you wouldn't refer to him as autistic. But in general, what the autistic community is asking for is that language. So you can always ask someone if they have a preference. All right, so when we talk about why not blue, blue is associated oftentimes with grief and loss. It's used by agencies with no autistic voices or relatively no autistic voices. And those agencies often use ABA, which is applied behavior analysis. Essentially, it's behaviorism. If you do this, then I'll give you this as a reward. Now, there's always a certain amount of that we've done in education. But when we talk about autistic students, if you listen to many autistic adults, they live with PTSD now because of the time spent in ABA therapy, which really told them to hide who they were in order to get what they wanted. So we don't want them to have to mask. We don't want anyone to have to mask who they are in order to be successful. But the blue is associated with that for many autistic people. So it's also associated, and I'm sorry, I do want to point out here, those agencies seek to cure autistic people. When I say those agencies, there is more than just one, but I do want to specifically point out, you saw Autism Speaks on this graphic. That is one that the autistic community really has the most problem with right now because it is probably the loudest and most recognized. And what what these points are here with the blue is specifically what Autism Speaks has struggled with the autistic community. So for instance, they look to cure autistic people. Again, autistic people don't need cured. It's not a disease. It's also associated with the false narrative with blue that boys are more likely to have autism, to be autistic. And really, when it comes down to it, when they're looking into it more, it is probably more that the girls were masking more. So, you know, when we look at how girls tend to be pleasers more, they want their teacher to be happy with them. They want others to be happy with them. So there's actually research to suggest that it's not that boys more often are autistic. It is that girls learn to mask at a younger age. They're still autistic. So for the autistic community, red is the opposite of that. It stands for love and passion. So that's why we say light it up red. All right, so then the question really becomes, what do you expect from your students? If you have students who are autistic, maybe you don't know if a student is autistic or not, but if you have one set of expectations in your classroom for all of your students, we need to look at what those expectations are. And it's not just for autistic students, it's really for neurodivergent students across the board, and for your introvert students, your introverted students, and all of that. But our expectations do play a large part in making an inclusive environment, especially for our autistic students. So with the what do you expect, I want you to think how if you are listening to someone, how you are showing that you're listening. I want you to think about it. For instance, even in our meeting right now, many of you don't have your cameras on. I'm assuming that you're listening. But if you were in the classroom, I might say, well, you're not making eye contact with me, so you're not listening. But I feel like you're here, so you're probably listening, even though I can't see your face. So Amanda puts in maintain eye contact and converse with him. Okay. What else? How else do you feel like you know that you're showing people that you're listening to them? Verbal add-ins. I smile a little bigger at that one because I think there are some times when I've been talking to people on the phone, and if I don't give them enough verbal add-ins, then like are you listening? My mom sometimes, are you listening? Are you okay? I'm like, yes, I'm just listening. Barbara says, yes, in virtual teaching, one of my students would play with his puppy and I could, of course, see. Another played video games. Hey, repeat back to them what they said. Facial expressions with emotion. Those are all great ways that you've said body language, but those are all neurotypical ways of telling or considering whether someone is listening. So that's what we need to do. I'm assuming if you're here, chances are you are neurotypical, or at least you believe you're neurotypical. And so you operate in this same sense that I do, that if you're making eye contact with me, if you're nodding at me, if you're throwing in little verbal add-ins, if you're making facial expressions, then you're listening. Now, if you're also like me, I know that I have faked some of those before. I've nodded when I feel like it's appropriate. Maybe my eyes have glazed over, right? Maybe I have been able to repeat back what someone has said, but I really wasn't present in the conversation. Maybe my facial expressions are going off of the last word that someone said, and I look around the room and, oh yes, I'm shocked by that also. So those are things that we use, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're listening. And that's where we need to think about other ways to have expectations of our students showing us that they're with us, that they're learning, that they're paying attention, that don't necessarily require what we consider the norms to show that. Okay, so one of the first things when we talk about that is this conversation of the autism spectrum. So the spectrum isn't linear. When we talk about a linear spectrum, the reason why we don't want to use a linear spectrum anymore, the reason why the autistic community asks to look at it as a circle for the spectrum is because a linear spectrum makes it too easy to go to functioning labels. It makes it too easy for me to say, well, you're on this end of the spectrum, so you're high functioning, and you're on this end, so you're low functioning. Instead, it's more like a circle. And you can see in these examples here, okay, these circles are cut into essentially pie pieces. And each of those pie pieces is some characteristics. So social skills, fixations, routines, sensory issues, stimming, perception, executive function, other. These are all areas that all of us have abilities in. Some are low and some are high. But if we're not autistic, because no, we're not all a little autistic. That's not a thing. Okay. Now, genetically, autism, they've shown, is you're predisposed to have a genetic connection. So I have a son who is autistic. I am not autistic myself, but I can see where some of those things came from. I can see how I also led to that. So I know that it's a genetic thing, and that's not bad. Okay. So when I look at this, if it was a neurotypical person, what we would see is pretty even among here. There would be some that were lower and some that were higher, but we would be pretty even around the circle. But if it's an autistic person, what we're going to see that there are areas that need more help. They need more instruction. They need more support in getting higher in, okay, to being more comfortable with, to doing better with. So in this case, for a person like this, that would be sensory issues and fixations are their lowest areas that they need the most support in. So when we start looking at it as a circle, we see a whole person. Now we're looking at the whole person and all of them instead of just they're at the high or the low end of the spectrum. So when we talk about high functioning and low functioning, the reason that that's so harmful to the autistic community is that for someone who would be considered high functioning, they are going to be more likely to be denied services because they seem normal. And I use normal as neurotypical, essentially. So my own son, remember I said the principal wasn't sure that he was going to allow him to go through the process because he was getting good grades. He was smart. Okay, well, you don't have to be unintelligent to be autistic. And this type of linear spectrum only reinforces that idea. And so now with my son accommodations, a teacher, especially as he gets older, may be less likely to provide that accommodation because they don't think that he needs it. Well, we can't tell from looking at someone whether they need it. If the accommodation is there, they have it for a reason. The same goes for someone on the low end of the autism spectrum. They actually then get the opposite of that, where let's say that someone is they don't communicate verbally. Then what tends to happen is we assume that that means unintelligent. And we say, well, they're the low end of the spectrum. They're low functioning. Someone can be exactly the same cognitive level as the person next to them, the same age as them, and not be able to speak verbally. That has nothing to do with your intelligence. That just simply means you have to find another way to communicate. So again, a linear scale there, a linear spectrum just has us assuming that this person that you've placed on the low end of the spectrum needs so much assistance and isn't capable of doing anything on their own, and you don't let them see what they're capable of because you have an assumption that they're just low all around everywhere. So instead, when we look at it as that circle, then we can see the areas that they really need support in. Just making sure there wasn't anything new in the chat, sorry. The other thing there, I have just given kind of in this slide, just a reminder of the things that we talked about. That it's disability first language that many autistics prefer. Again, not all. You can ask what the preference is. My son did not used to have a preference. He now does. He would prefer to be referred to as an autistic person, but he didn't used to have a preference. And I've changed as his preference has changed. You know, I've honored what he wants. Just a reminder that we don't refer to people as having Asperger's. We're not all a little autistic. And then again, that non-verbal communication doesn't mean unintelligent. If you've never seen Jordan Zimmerman, she works with the Nora Project. I highly recommend that you check her out. She does not speak. She does not have verbal form of communication. She uses a device, a personal device that she types everything and it speaks for her. She is absolutely a very intelligent woman. They have a movie about her and her struggles to get to that point too. But she is a great resource. The Nora Project in general is a great resource. I see we have something in the chat, so let me just open it up. Oh, Frank, you went to her session? Yes, at IdeaCon. She is, I just love her. Maria, I'm putting her name in the chat right now for you. Jordan Zimmerman. I think she's a phenomenal human and someone that really does illustrate that point. It goes beyond what our stereotypes are, and that's what she's great at doing. All right, so this is where we kind of started with those expectations. When I asked you how you know if someone is listening, this came up on Twitter in June of last year, and it was something that really stuck with me for this particular purpose of talking about our neurodivergent students. So it said, what do you think about SLANT, which stands for sit up, listen, ask and answer questions, nod your head, interact with the speaker. Now, generally in my workshops on this topic, what I would do is have us go through each one of those and write your expectations and then talk about them. And then we would kind of see maybe what we require and what we think of as listening isn't always what truly is listening. So when we talk about sitting up, my son is 6'4" at 14. Sitting up is oftentimes uncomfortable for him in the desks that are in the school because he is much too large for them. His being autistic, he has some additional like body struggles at times with just, I guess, like the weight of sitting up fully and holding himself straight and that kind of thing. So a lot of times he will want to put his head down, he'll go towards his desk. He is absolutely still listening. He could repeat every word to you. And in fact, teachers have given him the chance. I will let you put your head down if you can tell me what we're talking about. And he can. But that's the thing. Sitting up for him is actually distracting because sitting up for him means thinking about how uncomfortable he is in this desk that doesn't fit him. It's thinking about how much his back hurts right at that moment. And even when we sit at our own desks, sometimes when we get that moment, right, if it's our prep period and we get to sit down, maybe it's the first time that we've sat down all day, we might still have something that we're doing. We might be grading papers. We might be listening to a webinar. We might be having someone in our room for a meeting. But because we've sat down and we need that time to decompress, we might find that our head goes onto our hand and we sit like this, but we're still listening. I can still listen to you, even though I'm not sitting up straight. The same thing with what it means to be listening. That's what I asked you. How do you do that? And we talked about that I can fake a lot of those things that we put in with that listening. Ask and answer questions. This one, not even just for autistic people, not just for neurodivergent people, but your introverted students. If you expect them to ask and answer a question on the fly, they need more processing time than that. That is expecting something that is very uncomfortable from a large number of your students. That doesn't mean that they should not have to have questions, but do they need to ask it right at that moment? Can there be a processing time? Maybe it's setting a timer for a minute and saying, okay, during this minute, you're going to write a question, preparing them for it. We're going to listen to this. When it's done, I'm going to set a timer for a minute and I'm going to ask you to write a question. If you set it up and there's a process, your autistic students are far more likely to be involved because they like routine. Breaking routine is very difficult, which is why if you have an autistic student, it's in your class, you might notice if you're gone from the room, those days tend to be harder days. If there's a different bell schedule, those days are harder days. Okay. Yeah. Exit tickets are great for questions. You're right. And then again, it's a routine. At the end of the day, I'm going to expect that you have a question to put on your exit ticket. Routines are huge. And it's something that in teaching, we know we have routines, but we also have to be so flexible and on the fly all the time that we sometimes forget that when a student really struggles with a change in routine, they're not just being difficult. It can actually be that the student can actually be almost incapable of moving past a routine change that they were not aware of, because everything in their world exists in that, like, this routine, this focus. I know I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. And a change in the routine is actually can make them physically ill. I also want to talk about whole body listening. So the graphic on the left is actually something that is sold on Teachers Pay Teachers. Whole body listening, when we talk about it, it's often compliance. Eyes are looking, brain is thinking, mouth is quiet, ears are listening, hands are to myself, legs are folded and still. That's a compliance thing for us. Again, with so many students in a classroom, and especially if they're littles, we need some kind of order, right? Again, I'm not suggesting that it's a free-for-all, but we have to shift our expectations on what whole body listening actually is. So this revised whole body listening shows that your eyes might be closed or open or looking wherever helps you listen. There are times, I want you to think about when you're listening, if you're really concentrating, my eyes might be actually pointed up to the ceiling as I'm taking in details. My eyes might be down on a paper because I'm taking notes. It doesn't mean that I'm not listening because I'm not making that eye contact. The hands, they might be fidgeting. Remember, this is like the stimming. They might be fidgeting, flapping, doodling. Yes, doodling, because doodling with your notes is, essentially sketchnoting. And that, again, research back to show both sides of your brain working enhances comprehension and your ability to synthesize that data and recall it. Your feet, walking, moving, staying still, or doing what helps you listen. Legs, walking, moving, staying still, however is comfortable for you, or doing what helps you listen. Body, moving or not moving, facing a direction that helps you listen. This is just the idea that the left, it's a cute graphic, but it's all compliance-based. What are we doing to make sure that it's an inclusive environment when we're talking about whole body listening? Still having expectations, but not valuing eye contact. Because here's something that most people don't understand. If you talk to the autistic community, again, remember, this can never be 100% for everyone. But when you talk to the autistic community, what you will find is that in general, eye contact is actually physically painful. So when someone avoids eye contact with you, now I was the queen of, you are not making eye contact with me. Look at my eyes. I was the queen of that with my students and my own children, until my own child made me realize he wasn't not listening, and also it hurt him. So when I started diving into this to find that there are autistic people that will actually equate it to sexual assault, to getting their eyes poked with pins. Like, it's not it's uncomfortable for me, which even then forcing our students to do something that's physically uncomfortable is questionable, but this is pain. So we have to, again, be able to rethink, what does that mean? Do I really need eye contact, and why? Also, telling a student to look, if a student has trouble making eye contact with you and you tell them to look over a person's shoulder and look at the wall, we don't want them to do that. That's masking. We're asking them to, again, mask who they are, change who they are to fit in with our neurotypical expectations. Instead, we should be asking ourselves, why do I need that eye contact? How else can they show me that they're listening? And so that I can respond to that. Giving them ways to cover up who they are isn't inclusive. And this is just a real whole body listening, a simpler graphic that was put out by Unique Me. which again just goes on the idea that it doesn't always look the same, that I can be listening with different things happening with my body. Okay, I wanted to make sure I left time for questions. So like I said, there is so much information out here. We've condensed it down. I've talked a lot. I've shown you some graphics. I've answered a few questions. But again, with all of the information that we've got out there, I just want to make sure I've given you time to ask questions, to process the information before we move on. So I'm actually going to have Heather stop the recording because I know that sometimes people are more comfortable asking questions when they know it's not being recorded.